And so I'll try to use these kind of observations about perceptual imagery to support a quite kind of what's the word? Yeah, I think quite a bold thesis about the nature of perceptual content and its relationship to aspects of kind of what are sometimes known as force. Okay, so that's just some background. So I'll just hopefully. Good, just change slide. Okay, so I must apologise in advance. My rather wordy slides. They basically they serve as a kind of a cue for me giving the talk. Okay, so just to kind of introduce some background concepts. So I'll take it that perceptual forms of sensory experience are ones that involve sensory appearances. So, for example, vision would be a completely standard example of a perceptual form of experience, because when we have visual experiences, things look to us to be certain ways. We seem to be confronted with certain sorts of facts in the world, and this is sometimes explained in terms of perception as a state that involves a certain content, where the content is presented to us as true, and I'll be saying more about that later on. Similarly, in audition, things sound to me to be a certain way, right? And therefore, audition is also, hearing is also a form of perceptual experience, because we have a corresponding form of appearance that's involved in the relevant experiences. And then precisely how far this extends is a matter for debate. So, for example, whether bodily forms of sensation involve appearances is something on which I'm not going to take any stand. But certainly there are some forms of perceptual experiences, right? So, you know, faced by this point, it's quite natural to consider, you know, what are the natures of the ways that things, for example, look to us to be in the course of, say, visual experiences. So, for example, you know, exactly what way do things look to me to be right now? Right now, I can give kind of straightforward verbal replies to this question. I can describe a screen with black edges and a kind of rather messy wall behind it, etc. But the resulting reply, in terms of the level of detail, etc., is actually rather poor. It seems to do a rather rough job of trying to capture precisely the way that things look to me. I mean, some people have thought that just the very translation into verbal conceptual form yields an account of the content of perceptual experiences which is just untrue to how they really are. But certainly a lot of stuff seems to be left out. And so I might try to kind of embellish this by adding in loads of extra detail. You know, I could try to talk about the precise nature of the colour that the screen seems to me to possess, the particular words I can see, and so on and so forth. But it's kind of natural to think that even in doing that, still what I say is going to, the way I specify things as being, is going to actually fall rather short of accurately capturing the way that things actually look to me to be, right? So kind of using standard, generally comprehensible, non-indexical language seems to do a rather bad job at capturing the natures of the ways that things look to us to be, or sound to us to be, or feel to us to be on our skins and so on. But we can at least call upon indexicals here to get formulations that seem to be right. Right. So I could just say, for example, that things look to me to be like that. Right. Where I basically kind of make a demonstrative gesture at aspects of my current experience, and the resulting expression of the way things look to me to be is not going to be widely comprehensible, but nonetheless it does seem to capture accurately the way that things look to me to be, right? So, I mean, consider the way that things currently look to you to be, right, as you might put it, like that, right? So you seem to see a situation of a certain kind, and the situation seems to instantiate a certain way for things to be, right? And so a question we can ask here is just what aspects of the current experience are relevant or essential to the specification of this way for things to be. So if I say things are like that, right, precisely what parts of the phenomenology of the experience that I'm having, precisely what parts of that phenomenology are essential to fixing the identity of what it is to be like that, right? So in thinking about this, one idea that people have had about the nature of visual experience and perceptual experience more generally is that we can use a kind of analogy with assertion, right? So Richard Heck, in a well-known paper on non-conceptual content in the space of reasons, I think it is, from, I don't know when, says that one's visual experience has assertoric force, right? Because the experience presents things as obtaining to us, right? Just as if I make a certain assertion, I present a certain fact as true, right? Alternatively, another way it's put in the literature, Heck says this, Michael Martin says it, John Foster says it, it makes sense to describe the experience as being presentational, right? Because it seems to present us with things as being a certain way, right? So one idea people have had then is that you know, when things look to us to be a certain way, and so we have a perceptual experience because we enjoy some perceptual appearances, part of what's crucial to that idea is the thought that experiences have this assoteric force, right? They present things to us as being the case, right? So, I mean, in thinking about what all this means, I think the kind of attempts there that are given to specify this distinctive aspect of visual experience. I mean, it's the part that, for example, makes it natural to say that illusions and hallucinations involve some sort of error, right? Because they give us things as being a certain way and things aren't in fact that way, right? Now, these attempts to kind of reflect the way in which visual experience, auditory experience involves kind of commitments to things as being a certain way and thus can go wrong. These attempts are easily taken to suggest that there's a kind of clean distinction between two things, right? So on the one hand, there's the way that the experience characterizes things as being, as it's often put, is content, right? So there's the way that things are given to you as being, right? And this is part of what happens when the experience presents some things to you as being a certain way. So there's the way the experience presents things as being, and then there's also separately the presentation of things as being that way, right? So as it were, there's a certain content which is presented to us as obtaining, and the two things there are kind of different, right? And I mean, we get the model for this in assertion, right, and in, say, belief and other forms of propositional attitudes, right? So this, I mean, basically the model here has it that what it is for things to be like that, right, you know, so things now look to me a certain way. What way? Like that, right? So what it is for things to be like that is analogous to the condition that's presented as holding, for example, by means of an assertion that grass is green, right? Because in an assertion that grass is green, I can take the same content, I can deny it, I can merely suppose it for the sake of argument, right? I can query it. There's all sorts of different attitudes that one can have to the same content. So the content is, in this sense, kind of mobile. It can move around and be combined with different sorts of force, different sorts of presentations. One can present it as false. You know, I can deny that grass is green. I can present it as true, or I can just kind of take it as hypothetical and reason from it. Right. And so in those cases, the content, you know, the way things are characterized as being, is distinct from the force. Right, and it can be recombined with different forces, and it's quite natural, given this kind of way of talking about visual experiences, for example, as involving assoteric force. It's quite natural to read that as involving a similar sort of idea, that you can divorce the way things are presented to us as being in vision from the particular force that it's given to us with in vision, right, namely as true. And so one might, for example, have some kind of experience which is presented as false or something else, right, or just kind of entertained without being presented with any force at all. So all I want to do really in this talk is to consider whether that suggestion is correct. And so I want to think about whether, taking the case of vision, whether the way that things look to us to be is instead, whether it's inherently presentational, right? So the idea here is this. I want to kind of think about the question whether the nature of what it is for things to be like that, you know, the way that things look to me to be right now, whether that specification of a way for things to be, whether its nature can be separated from the way in which things are being given to me as being like that, right? So whether we can cleanly distinguish the force bit from the content bit, right, in vision. Right? So whether, as it were, vision is to be thought of as actually analogous to assertion, where we have a content that can be given with one or with various different forces, it can be denied or asserted or so on, or the question rather whether, in the case of vision and other forms of perceptual experience, the content bit, the way things look to us to be, is bound essentially to its presentation to us as true, right? And so, you know, kind of, I think in the literature, I mean, this isn't actually much discussed. I've not found it discussed, but I'm kind of hedging that because it may well be discussed. I mean, many philosophers are happy to identify the overall way that things seem perceptually to be in the course of a given perceptual experience with the experience's content, right? And once one does that, you know, there's a whole kind of truckload of ideas that start to rush in, given the history of content talk within philosophy, and particularly within recent philosophy, right? And in particular, I mean, content talk comes from really thought about propositional attitudes and conceptual thought and language, right? And there, it seems pretty clear that, although it has been denied, I have to say, has been denied in the linguistic case, but generally speaking, the very much orthodoxy has it that we can, in that case, divorce the commitment involved in, say, assertion or the denial bit in denial from the content that's presented as obtaining or which is denied, right? And so in the case of when people start talking about perceptual content, it becomes very natural to suppose that one can divorce the force component, right, in perception from the content bit. And as it were, what I want to do is to think about whether that's true, but I think there is a kind of weight of terminological inertia that rather pushes one to suppose it is. But on the other hand, I think there are kind of pressures that might lead one quite naturally to deny that this kind of force content distinction can be applied to perception. So many philosophers are tempted by the Phrygian idea that the nature of the content that belongs to a given mental state or episode, right, can be partly determined by the modes of presentation through which relevant items have been identified. So, for example, the way in which a certain colour is picked out in a belief is essential to the identity of the belief, right? Now, if I consider, for example, the way in which a certain shade of red, I can see one now, things stop shares. So if I consider the way a certain shade of red or a particular type of clanging noise, right, is given to me within a current perceptual experience, if I then ask the question, you know, just kind of introspectively, if I can excise the way in which the colour or the noise seems to be present, you know, in which it's given to me as just there, right, while nonetheless preserving the way in which within the experience it's being picked out, right? So the thought is you've got a kind of neutral identification of the thing, and separate from that, you've got it being given to you as present, right? Which just doesn't seem to me actually all that obvious that I can do that. I mean, I kind of get the request I'm being asked to make, but in the case of belief, it seems clear that we can kind of see things as picked out in this kind of neutral way, right? I can believe that Mars doesn't exist. And so, for example, the way in which Mars is picked out in my beliefs about Mars doesn't commit me to its existence. Right. But if I try to kind of apply that model to the case of, say, vision, and think about the way in which a colour is being given to me in vision, the idea that there's a kind of neutral identification of the colour that's independent of its actual apparent presence doesn't seem to me quite so obviously true, right? And so the status of the kind of presentational phenomenology that's involved in visual experience, it doesn't seem to me anyway, obviously, to mirror the status of, for example, the spoken words that figure in an assertion. Right. So in the case of the way when someone's talking and expressing content like that, the sounds just provide one among, you know, various different ways of articulating that content. One could say the same words in a different language. One could maybe sign them. I couldn't, or one could write them. Right. But it seems to me in the case of the experiential case, my grip on the very identity of the way that things look to me to be is just bound up essentially with the presentational phenomenology involved in the experience. And this is reflected by the fact that when I actually try and pick out exactly the way things look to me to be, I have to recourse to indexicals and appeal to phenomenological aspects of the current experience. I just have to indicate ostensibly the way that things look to me to be, right, and appeal to the actual experience itself, right. Now, clearly, this is all just kind of intuition prodding, right? I mean, there's no demonstration here that the ways that things seem to us to be in the course of perceptual experiences are indeed, as I've called it, inherently presentational. So there's no form of demonstration here that the ways that things seem perceptually to us to be are ever kind of partly constituted by the ways in which things are being given to us as present. But I think it's nonetheless a live option, and an interesting one, right? I mean, I think it seems to me to be intuitively just as plausible as the opposing view that one can have a clean force content distinction in the case of perception. And so, you know, I think one needs ideally decent arguments for going one way rather than the other, whereas in the literature, I think it's just not discussed. And when people do explicitly, if people do go one way, they tend to just assume that the force content distinction can be applied to the experiential case just as cleanly as it can be in the case of, say, assertion. Although I should say, actually, as just a kind of parenthetical remark, there are very strong forms of intentionalism, representationalism about perception that I think actually imply that you can't distinguish the force content view. I mean, if you think that content on its own is sufficient to determine all aspects of perceptual phenomenology, you're committed to this view, right? And some people, I think, do think that. Okay, so what I'm now going to do, though, is try to provide some further support for this inherent presentationality view by relating it to some considerations about perceptual mental imagery. So I'll be linking it up with stuff about the imagination here. So the imagination is going to make an entry. Okay, so first off, what I'm going to do then is, so I presented this inherent presentationality thesis, and I'm now going to kind of make some observations about supposed limitations to which perceptual mental imagery is subject. And then what I'll do is offer to explain these limitations using the hypothesis that perceptual experiences are inherently presentational in the way that I've explained. And then I'll say kind of consider some objections. Okay, so, I mean, one point that I think is pretty obvious is that, at least for many of us, the details of the scenes that are shown in mental visual images, they tend to be pretty sketchy, right, when compared to the sorts of scenes that we seem to see, right? And this is related, one might think, to the common idea that mental visual imagery, mental auditory imagery, is often relatively unvivid when compared to real perception. Right. So what I want to consider is whether this is merely an accidental limitation of perceptual mental imagery, or of certain kinds of perceptual mental imagery, or whether it reflects something more fundamental about the phenomenon. Right. So what I want to do is consider whether there could be a visual experience in which the total way that things look to be to the experience's subject couldn't also be the precise way that someone visualizes things as being in a relatively unvivid episode of visual imagery. So the question is, you know, how far can perceptual visual imagery, for example, or perceptual auditory imagery, if it's relatively unvivid, is it inevitably going to fall somewhat short of capturing the full content of perceptual experiences? Right, that's the basic question I want to consider. Right. So I mean, one tradition in the literature that starts with Hume, as far as I know, I mean, he's the person who analytic philosophers always cite as starting this, but it probably started before him. But other people more recently have written about this, Emily Kine's written about it, but the general idea of kind of imaginative vividness is all over the place, right? And so a common idea about perceptual mental imagery and actually generally sensory mental imagery and real experiences is that sensory mental imagery is, generally speaking, less vivid than real sensory experiences. So, for example, if I in a moment remember the way that things just look to me to be, the memory that I conjure by means of imagery will be less vivid than the actual experience that I'm recalling, right? So, you know, one natural question that one can then ask is, what does this mean? I mean, it seems to be corresponding to some sort of evident phenomenological fact. Can we say a bit more about what exactly it is? And when people have done that, it's proved to be surprisingly hard, to the degree that some people have expressed skepticism just about the whole idea that there's really a solid contrast here. So there's a fairly recent paper by Amy Kind where she runs through various potential ways in which one might understand this vividness idea and finds all of them wanting. But I think there are potential aspects of ways of understanding the distinction that she doesn't actually consider, which are a bit more solid. And so I think, in particular, focusing on the perceptual case, I think one striking aspect of the difference between perceptual mental imagery and perceptual experiences has to do with the presence of perceptual appearances in experiences and their general lack within relatively unvivid perceptual mental imagery, right? And so I'll say a bit more about that shortly, but one thing to note is that this kind of general idea of differences of vividness seems to result in kind of representational differences, right? So the fact that my auditory images of the way a certain trombone sounds, for example, the fact that those auditory images are less vivid than a real experience of a trombone seems to mean that, you know, when I recall the sound of the trombone, some information is lost, right? The way that the image represents things as being is in certain respects, for example, less specific than the way the timbres actually sounded to me when I really heard them, right? So the thought is then that we have differences of vividness between perceptual mental images and perceptual experiences, and those differences have representational consequences. They mean that the ways that things are shown as being in relatively unvivid perceptual mental images fall short of the ways things are given to us as being within corresponding perceptual experiences, right? So that differences of vividness have representational consequences, right? So yeah, now, if I consider some specific colour of something I can see now, right? If I were to then entertain some relatively unvivid visual mental imagery of that colour, yeah, the relative unvividness of the imagery means that I wouldn't quite get a hold on exactly the same colour, right? Because it's going to be given to me in a fundamentally different way in the imagery because the imagery is less vivid. And so we have ramifications for vividness from vividness with regards to representational powers. Okay, so the point of this section then was just that differences of vividness between perceptual mental imagery and perceptual experiences seem to have representational consequences. And that of course raises a question, why? Right? And so what I'm going to try and do is to explain those differences in terms of this thesis about perceptual content. So, okay, so what explains this link between the relative lack of vividness and these common representational limitations in relation to perceptual experiences? So there are numerous kind of standard ways in which people have sought to contrast our perceptual imaginations with the real experiences that we have within suitable modalities, so visual images and visual experiences. But for my purposes, one particular difference between most perceptual images and perceptual experiences is going to be absolutely crucial. And so this, and I mentioned this previously, is that perceptual experiences involve perceptual appearances. Right, but I take it that relatively unvivid perceptual imaginings don't feature perceptual appearances. Right, and so one interesting, so certainly, I mean, just speaking for myself, when I have a relatively unvivid perceptual imagining, it's not like the thing is really there. Right, if the thing was really there, it wouldn't be unvivid anymore. Right, I'd be actually having a vivid, some kind of vivid, weird imaginative experience, if it even still counted as imagining. Right, so maybe there can be imaginings that produce real visual appearances, but they're certainly surely going to be vivid ones, right? And I mean, in support of this, there's a kind of growing body of work on imagery deficiencies and excesses, as it were. And so hyperphantasics are people who have extremely vivid mental visual images, and in some of these cases, they seem to be vivid enough that actually, when they report the experiences, the visualizations and so on, they report actually, as it were, experiencing the things that they're imagining, right? And so that, there's kind of at least data supporting the idea that as vividness really ramps up, so it starts to push into actually the enjoyment of perceptual appearances. But of course, how to take this data is always going to be complicated. But it seems to me that anyway, relatively unvivid perceptual imaginings are not going to feature perceptual appearances. And so I take it that this is an important element in the general idea that perceptual experiences are standardly more vivid than perceptual mental images, right? But if this is right, then I think we can use this point to explain why there are aspects of perceptual appearances that can't be faithfully and inexhaustively captured by unvivid perceptual mental imagery. Or at least we can do this if we allow that perceptual contents are, as I put it, inherently presentational. That sometimes there's no divorcing the content of a perception from its being given to us as actually obtaining within the experience. So to see how the thought goes here, so things currently now look to me to be a certain way, as I can put it, like that, right? Just appealing to the way, just demonstratively to the experience I'm having. Okay, so let's suppose though that the way that things look to me to be is inherently presentational. Right. So suppose that is that what it is for things to be like that, right, the way that things look to me to be, is partly constituted by the manner in which various aspects of the visually apparent situation, so the various colours in audition, various sounds, by the way in which those various components are being given to me as there, right, the way in which they seem to me to be actually present. Then any episode that represents things as being that same way, as being like that, is going to have to present the relevant aspects of the situation, you know, the colours in the visual case, the sounds in the auditory case. It's going to have to present them in the same way, right? And so it's going to have to give them to me as actually present, because that's an essential part that constituted an essential part of the way that things look to me to be, right? But of course, any episode that's like my current visual experience in presenting these features as actually present is going to have to feature some visual appearances, right? But that means then that relatively unvivid mental visual images, right, relatively unvivid visualizations, well, they don't involve visual appearances, right? You don't experience colors, etc., as actually there when you have relatively unvivid visual mental imagery. But that means then that no passage of relatively unvivid visual mental imagery is ever going to explicitly show things as being precisely the way that things looked to me to be, right? Because it's not going to be able to give me the components of the situation in the required ways, because to do that, it would have to give them to me as actually being there, right? So I think that the view that the ways that things seem perceptually to us to be, as many people would say, the perceptual contents, that these are sometimes inherently presentational, that you can't divorce the content and the force component, it provides a nice explanation of why these phenomenological differences between experiences and images, right, in terms of vividness, why they place representational restrictions upon perceptual mental imagery. Right. And so the thought here is just this, that the very ways in which items are identified for us in perceptual experiences are sometimes beyond the reach of unvivid perceptual mental imagery, at least, because the ways of picking out the relevant items essentially give them to us as actually present. Right. But of course, then any episodes in which things are given to us as actually present, they feature perceptual appearances, in which case we don't have unvivid perceptual mental imagery after all. Right. And so perceptual mental imagery, at least when it's relatively unvivid, is going to be inevitably subject to falling short in relation to the contents of perceptual experiences, or to the ways that things look, sound, etc., to us to be. So I just want to just note a crucial point about the previous argument and the way in which it's different from another one, right? So someone might say the following, right? And they might say, well, look, in the course of perceptual experiences, things seem perceptually to us to be certain ways. Right. Now, passages of perceptual mental imagery maybe essentially are ones that don't feature perceptual appearances. Right. So we've got a contrast between perceptual experiences, things seem to us to be there, and perceptual images where that's not true. Right. So obviously then, there's an aspect of perceptual experience, this inherently presentational stuff, that's not reflected by mental imagery, because you've got appearances in the case of experiences, but they're not present in the case of images. Right. But so what? Right. I mean, that's hardly news, right? I mean, you know, to take a similar case, a mere representation of an assertion that 0 is equal to 1 is not an assertion of that proposition, right? So there's a difference between, in general, between assertion and representing assertion, for example, right? So, I mean, so what if images don't involve appearances, but experiences do? I mean, why is that news? Okay, but that's misunderstanding the crucial point about the previous argument, right? Because the point of the argument was not just that, perceptual experiences involve appearances, but images don't, right? Rather, it's meant to be using points about the lack of appearances in perceptual mental imagery to derive a conclusion concerning the ways that things seem to us to be, right? The putative facts that we seem to encounter within perceptual experiences, right? A conclusion not concerning just, as it were, the assoteric nature of perception, but a conclusion concerning perceptual content, right? So the analog of the point just made, right, in relation to assertions is this, right? So the analog of the previous point isn't just the banal point that, you know, if I said that someone asserts something, I haven't thereby asserted it, right? The parallel is the much more interesting thesis that sometimes there are contents where if you say someone asserted it, you have to assert it too, right? There's no divorcing, the content from the assertion of it. So there's no, as it were, neutral representation of it just as asserted, right? So it's a kind of much stronger thesis than just the point that perception involves stuff seeming to be true, whereas imagery doesn't, right? It's quite different to that. Okay, so what I now want to do is just consider some additional kind of general objections to the the whole thing. So one initial objection might just be this, that this kind of idea of inherent presentationality is just too vague and ill-defined to make any real sense, right? So I've said, you can't divorce content from force, right? And you might think this is just metaphor, right? And it's just not clear enough to do any work with. But I don't think that's actually true. And I think or at least rather, I think it's not clearly any more true for this view than it is for a view that people have for a long time taken very seriously within the philosophical literature, right? So what I'm now going to do is make an analogy between this inherent presentationality idea and a very famous, very well-known bunch of ideas owed to Frege. So consider the standard datum that although Barbara Cartland and Marcus Belfry, Barbara Cartland wrote this enormous number of romantic novels and died a while ago. Anyway, Barbara Cartland and Marcus Belfry were one and the same author. They were, right? Now, someone might believe, nonetheless, that Barbara Cartland was an author without believing that Marcus Belfry, the author of Apocalypse of the Heart, believing that that person was an author, right? So why is that? So many philosophers have followed Frege, right? And they've held that this can be explained if we take it that what someone believes is partly determined by how suitable things are picked out within the belief, right? So, the classic Hesperus phosphorus stuff. Right, the way something is presented to us or picked out within a belief is partly determines what it is that we believe, the content of the belief. Now, the force of this explanation, which is a standard explanation, it depends on the coherence of a view about the nature of what people believe. Right, the view is that the nature of precisely what someone believes partly depends upon how suitable items are kind of existentially neutrally identified within the belief, right? The way something is picked out within a belief determines what it is exactly that someone believes, right? So the explanation's force depends upon a constitutive thesis concerning what it is that people believe to be the case, right? And this constitutive thesis, I claim, is analogous to the way I'd want to anyway explain this previous claim about the inherently presentational nature of the ways that things seem perceptually to us to be. Because I'd want to explain that in the following way, right? It's the idea that the nature of the way that things seem perceptually to me to be, right? Just the nature of that, as it's sometimes put, content, may be partly determined by the manner in which relevant items are being presented as actually present, right? So it's a constitutive thesis that doesn't involve existentially neutral ways of picking things out, but which rather involves ways in which things are being given to us as there, right? Now, this obviously is not exactly the same as the Fregean view, right? But so what? Yeah. The Fregean view is not the only coherent constitutive thesis one can advocate, right? And in particular, the notion of a way that a perceptual experience gives something to us as present makes surely immediate phenomenological sense, right? I mean, it's kind of one of the basic data points in thinking about perception, that things are given to us as there, right? And there's nothing, I think, in this notion that makes it somehow more suspect than the idea of a way in which something is identified within a belief. I mean, it in fact has much more phenomenological vividness, right? The idea of kind of the way things are picked out in a belief is because of the way in which beliefs have much less by way of a current phenomenology associated with them, is much more distant and kind of abstract than this idea of the way in which something is just given to us as there within an experience. And so it seems to me that if one is happy enough with the idea that precisely what one believes is partly determined by suitable kind of existentially neutral modes of identification, then the claim that what someone perceives may be partly determined by modes of givenness as actually present, this seems to me it ought to be untroubling, right? The relative terms of the equation are no more problematic than one another in each case. And indeed, as I say, I think the perceptual case is in some ways more straightforward. So, okay, so that's one worry, and hopefully, so the thought is at least we can explain this view in a way that makes it at least as clear as the Fregean view. And of course, a lot of people have rejected the Fregean view, but nonetheless, it surely is a view that warrants taking seriously. Okay, so another objection would be this, that so ways for things to be, these are contents. Right. And so someone might say, well, the very application of the notion of content in any given case requires that we should be able to distinguish content from force. Right. So the very idea of content is bound essentially to its kind of forceless neutrality. Right. And so, okay, so that would be a worry. Now, philosophers do standardly think of conceptual propositional contents as being kind of highly mobile, right? So the, the standard way of thinking about the contents of propositional attitudes has it that they can jump around from attitude to attitude. You can assert them, you can deny them, you can doubt them, you can suppose them for the sake of argument, and so on, right? And so maybe what that might tell us then is that perceptual contents aren't conceptual propositional contents, right? But I mean, that all this might be telling us then is that we ought to regard perceptual contents as not being conceptual and propositional, right? It doesn't obviously tell us that we should deny that perceptual contents are inherently presentational, right? So we might just want to say that this holds true for some contents, but it doesn't hold true for perceptual contents. We might say that actually it holds true for conceptual contents, and therefore perceptual contents aren't conceptual, and that's hardly an unknown view in the literature, right? But I think more generally, it's not at all clear why one would think that the very notion of content is in fact so rich that it requires a clean force-content distinction, right? But anyway, the final point, it would be, I think, bizarre to insist that that none of the ways that things seem perceptually to us to be are inherently presentational, right? Just because if we say that, we can't equate them with contents, right? If the notion of perceptual content is too narrow to contain these phenomena, then it should be dumped, right? So I guess the question here is, is revolving around how much theoretical content there is to the idea of content, and how bound it is to this distinction between force and content. I don't actually have an opinion on that. I mean, if someone wants to say that it's essentially bound to it, then go ahead, and I'll just use a different word. So this doesn't seem to me a substantial worry, really. But I think there is a more specific worry that can be raised, and that's the question, I think this is the last thing, yeah. That's the question, well, precisely what aspects of the ways that things seem perceptually to us to be are meant to be inherently presentational, right? So is it all of them, right? You might think, well, look, if, for example, the way that colours are given to me within visual experience, if those are inherently presentational, so I can't divorce the identification of the colour from the way in which it seems to me to be there, right? Or if the way clanging sounds are given to me in hearing, if that can't be divorced in this kind of way, then you might think, where's this going to stop? I mean, surely the same is going to hold true for visual textures, right? For shapes, for the way lights are reflected off things, etc., 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 right? So it might seem that there's just no chance of marking off some but not all aspects of the ways that things seem perceptually to us to be as inherently presentational, right? But I think this does raise a substantial issue. For let's suppose that all of the ways that things seem to us to be are inherently presentational. So every single aspect of the way that things now look to me to be, for example, right? There's no way of distinguishing the way in which any of that is picked out from the way in which it's given to me as actually present. Okay, well, previously I argued that where something is an inherently presentational aspect of, say, visual content, it's not going to be capturable by means of relatively unvivid visual mental imagery, right? But if we have then that all of the aspects of the ways things look to us to be, for example, if all of them are inherently presentational, then we're going to get that none of them can be captured within relatively unvivid visual mental imagery, right? But this is then bizarre, right? Because, if unvivid visual mental imagery can't capture any aspects of the ways that things look to us to be in any visual experiences, then it's not clearly in any sense visual, right? And so there is obviously a potential worry here if too much stuff is inherently presentational. That would kind of interact with the arguments I presented earlier to create problems, certainly for views I have about the visual nature of, say, visual mental imagery, or the auditory nature of auditory mental imagery, and so on. So what is to be done here? Well, I think the solution, which I've come to be persuaded of, but that might, of course, just reflect the fact that I have to be persuaded of it. I think the solution is, in fact, to say that some but not all aspects of perceptual content are inherently presentational, right? I think there's actually good reasons for thinking this. So, if I look at, for example, a certain patch of grass in my back garden, right? The grass doesn't just look to me to be a highly specific shade of green, right? It will also look to me to have the more general property of, as I put it very roughly, being green, right? We can see this by considering, for example, if I have if my eyes focus, if I see two green patches of grass and a yellow patch, the two green patches, even if they're somewhat different, are going to look to me, I think literally look to me, to be more alike than they look to the yellow patch of grass, right? And presumably that's because the visual experience is giving them to me as having some relatively abstract color property in addition to the highly specific color properties that they seem to instantiate, right? Where that relatively abstract color property isn't shared with the yellow patch of grass that I can also see, right? But I take it that I can visualize in a relatively unvivid mental visual image something as being that more broad shade of color, right? I take it I can recall, for example, the broad shade of color that the relevant patch of grass seemed to me to have on the previous occasion, even if I can't, within a relatively unvivid visual mental image, characterize it as having precisely the color that it then looked to me to have, right? So that suggests then that there are, for example, relatively general aspects of perceptual content which can be shared with visual mental imagery, and which, therefore, I'm going to conclude, aren't inherently presentational, right? So in fact, I kind of want to argue like this, that relatively unvivid perceptual mental images can share contents with suitable experiences, with suitable perceptual experiences, but by the previous arguments, that tells us that those aspects of content cannot be inherently presentational, and therefore, I'm going to say, yeah, perceptual experiences incorporate both inherently presentational and non-inherently presentational aspects of content. And I think there's actually quite good introspective support for that idea in relation, as I say, for example, to relatively non-specific properties that are presented within imagery, but which also seem to be presented within perceptual experience. So yes, I'll stop there.